Today on The Deep Dive, we're taking a look at the Melbourne Football Club. So they've had some wonderful times and also some lean times. And take a look at their history and pretty good win-loss, to be honest. You know, winning almost at 50% and 18 grand finals, most of those in times Damo's going to talk about, and 13 premierships. And look at that from David Neate. So the games and goals record holder, what a superstar he's been. When we look at who has been the greatest demon of all time, plenty of Brownlow medalists as well. Shane Woden being the most recent in a grand final year in the year 2000, and Jimmy Steins, Peter Moore, Brian Wilson, and obviously didn't know the previous two, but superstar players. But Damo, they had a great time but in the early eras.
In the 50s, Llordo, in the 60s. When we talk about dynasties, there's none like the Melbourne dynasty in that period. From 1955 to 64, they won 6 premierships. They finished top of the ladder every season from 1955 through to 1960 inclusive, and then obviously played in 7 straight grand finals, 1954 to 1960, and very nearly won all of them. But it just set them up. Obviously, Norm Smith and Ron Barassi were central to that before Barassi took his career elsewhere, which you'll touch on shortly, TJ, but it was just iconic. And again, we've sort of got used to teams winning 3 premierships in the modern era and talking about them as dynasty type clubs, but there's nothing like what Melbourne did in that period.
No, and of course it's hard to talk about Melbourne without mentioning the great Ronald Dale Barassi, who sadly passed away last year, and he figured in those 6 premierships that Damo alluded to. He was just absolutely brilliant. You know, I mentioned Lou Richards before, and he said that there was no greater inspirational player. Just being on the ground, Ron Barassi lifted everyone around him because he did what he demanded. He was a 2-time best and fairest player there, and not only did he, sort of work that craft with Melbourne, he went on to coach at 4 clubs, including the Sydney Swans, which is where we pick him up here.
Hello? Haley off!
And the Melbourne experiment, the second time round, TJ didn't...
Yes, sorry. He also coached Melbourne, yep. Yeah,
the Melbourne experiment didn't work for him, did it, at the end of it all? But obviously went to Sydney after that as well, but the 2 premierships at North Melbourne as well.
Norm Smith was sacked in 1965, and that's where they say the curse of Melbourne started, the curse of Norm Smith, where they didn't play finals for 22 years. And here is Norm Smith speaking back in the day around his sacking.
No word of mouth, no one would come and tell me, just special messenger turned up and handed the letter, and I read the letter, and I would say that I was rather shocked. We got arguing at the committee over something on Wednesday night. I said, you went to a big school, you went to a public school, I went to a state school. I said, but they still spelt principle the same way. And it's the principle for which I am fighting. The repercussions I would like it to have is that every Melbourne Football Club supporter and every Melbourne Cricket Club supporter registers a protest in the strongest terms at the way it's been handled. Get rid of these blokes. That's the only way the club will progress.
Imagine being part of that interview.
Wow.
And he coached 6 premierships at Melbourne and yet sacked unbelievably at the time, and they didn't recover for a long, long period of time. Or maybe did. Yeah.
Talk about Melbourne, you've got to talk about Robbie Flower, don't you, Llordo? One of their absolute stars in the history of their footy club. Now, a star in dark times as well, 272 games. 315 goals, and how silky smooth did he cover the ground in the air. And I mean, he's quite a unique sort of player, isn't he, with the way he was able to cover the ground in his finish, and just a beautiful player, well-rounded.
It was the reason a lot of people watched Melbourne at that stage, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it was his whole sort of career was spent in the period where they just weren't able to perform, and then they finally got there and he was injured, but it was an amazing career.
Well, his last season was 87, and what a season it was. And in the last round, they had to beat Footscray to progress, but they also had to rely on the Hawks beating the Cats down in the Cattery, and that job got done. So they ticked that off and they played finals. And then Simon Eichhold in the prelim takes this mark and does that. And then it goes back down the other end, as we know. So the kick out happens, they get the ball out, it goes over the back, they take the mark to Buckenara, they let the ball out the back, Buckenara takes the mark, maybe too far out, they're going to have to kick it 60, 55 metres, and then Jimmy Steins runs across the mark, 15 metres, still has to kick it from 45 out, 45-degree angle, and Gary Buckenara puts them through to the premiership. And have a look at the Demons supporters.
It's a goal! It's a goal!
They went on to play the Blues, who many thought that the Demons had a better chance than against the Hawks, and the Blues ran right when it was about 33 degrees.
And the 57-year drought of a Melbourne premiership was broken only a couple of years ago in the COVID era, where Melbourne went and won it in Perth. what a side they were, and it was all the Dogs early, and then they ended up, it was like a nearly 100-point turnaround. The Demons winning by 74 points. Petrarca winning the Norm Smith medal. What a player.
Kicked 16 of the last 17 goals of that game, being down by 19 points about halfway through the third quarter. And what they did just before three-quarter time of that particular night was all-time legendary sort of stuff.
Like any club, Melbourne's had some great characters over the journey, but I don't think there's ever been two like these two. We'll start with Alan Jakovic, the brother of Glenn, or some might say Glenn is the brother of Alan. And he was just burst onto the scene. When you say players burst onto the scene, he burst onto the scene. He actually worked here at Channel 9 in staging, although he went around and told everyone he was a producer. And then I think he's over. Is he fishing in WA these days? But Alan Jakovic, he was just sensational to watch, and there was a bit of byplay with his brother. Then you had this man who played at several clubs, Mark Jacko Jackson. Kelvin Moore not taking too kindly to it. The handstand. You know, there's certain players that you go to watch specifically. And what we forget is, a bit like Warwick Capper, what you forget is he was actually a bloody good full forward.
Yeah, he was.
Right? He was a very good kick for goal. He was a very talented footballer who brought something to the game. He brought something to the game. I don't know how he would go in now, this era today, but and if anyone wants to Google open mic with Mike Sheen and Mark Jackson, that is something to behold.
Had his own single as well, which went
I'm an individual.
Went to number 2, I believe.
Probably number 1. I'm an individual. And he also had a successful show in America, not the Highwayman, but something like that.
Something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So we're going to go from Jacko to the best players of Melbourne's era, and we haven't included the current players, so we'll talk about that shortly. But there's Gary Lyon. So where does he sit in terms of great Demons of all time? Gary was inspiration for Demons through a long time. The back injury crippled him a little bit. Here's David Neitz, tough, skillful, could do it. He was their best fullback and full forward through a long, long period of time. The legendary, inspirational Jimmy Steins, as courageous as they get as a ruckman, and just could run all day long. Brownlow medalist, as we touched on earlier, so he was a wonderful player. Robert Flower, who Kane's just spoken about, so he'd have to be right in the mix. We're about to show the great Ronald Dale Barassi after this. Some Ron Barassi highlights. So, just the 31. So Bailey Fritsch wears it with pride right now. So that's where it's the most famous number in the history of the Melbourne Football Club. But Kane, I want to put you got Max Gawn, Christian Petrarca. Which one of the current day players do you think will go on and be regarded as potentially the best Melbourne player of all time?
Oh, and Oliver as well.
Oliver's one of the 4 best and fairest in that same period. Yeah.
Probably for the whole of the package and the captaincy, Max Gawn.
Yeah.
I think.
So where does it sit for you, Damo?
Yeah, I think Max Gawn is in the conversation now. Obviously, you can't go past Barassi, but I didn't see him play, obviously, but the legend that he's got, and I think David Neitz is sometimes overlooked in the wider picture. Sometimes, TJ, extraordinary career.
Brandy?
Well, if they're talking about potentially renaming the Premiership Cup to the Ronald Dale Barassi Cup, it says that obviously we never saw him play, but must have been one hell of a player to be bestowed that honour.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to have this conversation because we weren't around in the 50s when you had like Hassan Mann, Brian Dixon, Noel McMahon, all these guys that figured in that golden era that Damo spoke about. But Gary was fantastic to watch. Robbie Flower defied his build, but how do you go past Ronald Dale?